What is up, Ontario? Welcome back to the show. Today I'm going to talk to you about what Captain America taught me about faith. So here we go. Alright, so as many people know, this week we'll see the release of Captain America Civil War, which is obviously a big deal to anyone who has invested themselves in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. But even if that doesn't matter to you at all, even if that whole franchise is just nothing to you, this video will still be valuable, so just give me a chance. Captain America, of course, is a member of this group of superheroes called the Avengers, and the movie that's about to come out sees them facing actually an ideological difference and butting heads against each other. There is now an internal conflict within this group of former friends. But I don't actually necessarily want to talk about this upcoming movie as much as use it as an occasion to talk about the behavior we see from Captain America himself in the first Avengers movie. Captain America, he is a super soldier, he's super strong, and he came into his prime in the Second World War, but then got frozen and reawoken as still a young man in the present day. And so sometimes he's portrayed as being a little bit out of touch, maybe a little bit old-fashioned, which makes for an interesting dynamic between him and other characters. Especially in the first Avengers movie, there are some slight hints that this character, Steve Rogers, or Captain America, holds on to some traditional Christian type of worldviews. There's also these other characters, Thor and Loki, who, if you're familiar with Norse mythology at all, are gods in like the Nordic legends, and they've been adapted as superheroes for this franchise. And there's a scene in the first Avengers movie, Thor and Loki go flying out of this plane, locked in this conflict, and Iron Man flies out after them. Of course, Captain America can't fly, so he dons a parachute, and he's about to jump out after them. Black Widow, who's piloting the plane, turns back to him and says, "If I were you, I'd sit this one out, Cap. These guys are the stuff of legends. They're basically gods." To which Captain America retorts, "Ma'am, there's only one God, and I'm pretty sure he doesn't dress like that." And to me, it struck me as this great moment in the movie, because while the filmmakers were probably inserting this as kind of a joke line to make Captain America seem, old-fashioned and out of touch, there's actually a really cool application you can make with this concept. See, we have this understanding that we're inside of this big conflict between good and evil, and there are all kinds of different forces and names and titles and people and non-people who are contending for the position of God, who want to be seen as God, who want to maybe replace God and take his place, or suggest that maybe God, as we've understood him, isn't good enough and there's a better alternative. Satan himself would love nothing more than to exalt himself to that position of being seen as God. And what's interesting with Captain America's line in this movie is he responds to this claim that these beings are gods, and he responds with this classic Judeo-Christian understanding of how the universe works. There is only one God. Anything else that would claim to be such is infinitely less in power and influence and glory. But one thing I really wanted to zero in on was the second part of what he says, because he says, "Ma'am, there's only one God, and I'm pretty sure he doesn't dress like that," referring to the very strange outfits that Thor and Loki wear. But it does raise a good question. What does God look like to you? When you think of God, what do you picture? I don't necessarily mean like a physical description, but I mean, what is he like? Like, what characteristics does he have? The way you answer that question says a lot about where you're at spiritually. It says a lot about where you're at in your relationship with God. Because if you step outside of this kind of comic book universe that I'm talking about into the real world, there are forces trying to claim to be God, or to be gods. The Christian claim is contrary to that. And sometimes people aren't necessarily making the claim that these other things are God, but they'll take characteristics that are not like God and attribute them to him, painting a false picture of our God. And we can sometimes do this to ourselves by misunderstanding him. The point is, do you know what God looks like? Do you know what he's like? How does God dress? There's that famous passage in Ephesians chapter 6 that talks about us putting on the armor of God, and there's righteousness and justice and salvation and truth and all of these different characteristics that make up the armor of God that Paul advises the church to wear as a defense and a strength. What's really interesting is that the armor of God doesn't appear for the first time in the Bible in Ephesians. It actually also appears in Isaiah 59:17. God is looking out over the world and he sees all the injustice and he sees all of the violence and destruction, and it upsets him. So Isaiah paints this picture of God putting on his armor, which includes the breastplate of righteousness and the helmet of salvation, and he puts on this armor and he goes out to do battle against evil. And so when Paul says, put on the armor of God, and starts listing these various pieces, he's actually saying, put on the same thing that God wears. So if you want to talk in terms of spiritual warfare or spiritual battles, when the enemy comes after you and you're wearing the armor of God, what he sees is not you. What he sees is someone in God's armor who kind of looks a lot like God. This might be something to cause the devil a bit of a shudder of fear. What Paul is advising the church in Ephesus to do is become acquainted with, become familiar with these characteristics that make God who he is, that are his strength in combating evil, and then to make those our own as well. The book of Ephesians is really interesting because there's this dynamic of the church acting as a witness to the unseen powers of the supernatural world, that the forces beyond our vision are watching us, and through us, Ephesians 3:10 says, God is going to display his wisdom to them. And so the really cool role that we get to play as the church is living within the parameters of God's wisdom and his characteristics, and by doing so, saying to the powers, you are giving all kinds of different pictures of what God might look like, how he would present himself. But here's what he actually looks like. And it is in this emulation of God, in this putting on Christ, in this taking on his characteristics, that we become a witness that says, sorry guys, there's only one God, and he doesn't dress like that. So may you walk with him, knowing his strength, knowing his power, knowing his character, and may you be able to state with confidence, there's one true God, and this is what he looks like. And that is all I have to tell you about that. I am not going to tell you whether or not to be Team Captain America or Team Iron Man. That's your job to figure out. Time for some more updates right now. What's up guys, here at the Ontario Conference again. Just want to give you a heads up about camp meeting this summer. I know last summer we actually did not have camp meeting, so in many ways this is exciting that we're actually having it. This year things are going to be a little bit different because we are going to be having some outreach initiatives led by the youth. The main things we're going to be doing are a food drive, which will actually be taking place within the 5 major metropolitan regions in Toronto for 5 weeks leading up to camp meeting. We're going to be collecting food at different churches in the various regions, and then the day of camp meeting there's going to be collecting food donations from the immediately surrounding community and kind of compiling it all up for one big donation to a local food bank. There's also going to be a blood drive of sorts. We're going to be working alongside the Canadian Blood Services. At the actual event, at camp meeting itself, they won't be actually taking blood, but they will be doing a test that shows you your blood type and registering people to actually make a donation at one of their facilities. But it's still an important process, registering people, determining your blood type, and setting you up for an actual appointment to donate blood. It's a really great cause, and we're excited to be working with the Canadian Blood Services on that. Also, don't forget to get your church signed up with us for our social media directory. Currently, it is just a note on Facebook, on our Facebook page. If you go look up Adventist Youth Ontario, you'll find us there. But it will be going up on the Adventist Youth Ontario website, which will be launching very, very soon. We're excited for that. Make sure your church and all of your social media platforms are represented there so that people can find you and people can get a hold of your content and information. We want to make sure we're promoting everything that everyone's doing. Thanks so much for tuning into the channel. Make sure you've subscribed, and we'll see you next week. Peace out. And so Isaiah paints this picture of God putting on his armor, which includes that breastplate of